Now the other report presented today to create and share the remarkable success and contested future of the Nordic Social-Democratic Model will be presented by its author, Juhana Vartiainen, who is Director General at the Government Institute for Economic Research of Finland. Juhana, please.
Thank you, Hildur. Dear everybody, this paper is about why the modern political and economic political environment is difficult for the original creators of the Nordic social-democratic welfare state. It is difficult for all political parties to a large extent, but in my view, this challenge is particularly hard for social democratic movements and labor movements in the Nordic countries, and it is in order to improve the discussion within this movement that I have been trying to analyze these difficulties. One might start from this paradox that social democracy and this Nordic welfare state model, which is fundamentally a social democratic creature, it has really been a remarkable success, and one could say that together with the liberal democracy, this social democracy has won the Cold War. I mean, there is no doubt about that. And after this Cold War bipolar contradiction between communism and capitalism or market liberal democracy, after this has vanished, then the Nordic model seems to enjoy an unprecedented prestige, at least among economists and many even political commentators. So everybody likes the Nordic model, yet the Nordic social democracy seems to me weaker than what it was in the golden age from the 50s through the 80s, when these welfare states were established. And this is particularly clear from the point of view of expert economists like myself. We economists like the Nordic countries. The Nordic countries, in some way, they manage to combine very good things. They are very strong market economies. When we look at Nordic institutions, we realize that, in fact, they are quite market-driven in their policy institutions. There is hardly any protectionism. Product market regulation is quite weak. The Nordic countries run their macroeconomic policies very much according to the very sort of orthodox textbook ideas that were developed in universities like Chicago and others, which have been recommending rule-based, forward-looking, responsible economic policies for decades. They are open economies that like globalization. They are all for a sort of market-based and open economy solutions to economic arrangements. But they, at the same time, they are also very social democratic societies. They have encompassing social security and quite a good deal as to the health and education services that the ordinary citizen throughout his or her lifespan will get. So this the idea that is very natural to many economists like myself is that the market economy and the welfare state, they are not enemies competing of the kind of one political space. Instead, one could see them as symbiotic with each other. They are something that reinforce each other. And this is what I try to emphasize in the paper. These welfare state social democratic policies that were adopted from the 50s onwards, or from even earlier onwards, they were both expressions of socialist and social democratic ideals and aspirations, but they were at the same time extremely well designed and well aligned with the need to boost economic growth and an effective mobilization of a nation's resources in order to get economic well-being out of those resources. There are many aspects of these policies. We have high female labor market participation, these Nordic wage bargaining models that try to impose a rather uniform pay increase to throughout the economy. That of course sustains a process of creative destruction. We don't want to subsidize poor productivity firms by lower wages. Instead, we like the idea that the firms who are not able to increase their productivity as much as the others, they should vanish, they should go bankrupt, and then we would have more resources for expanding firms. This was the Rehn-Meidner idea in the 50s, in the Swedish wage bargaining discussion in the 50s, but it's also something that boosted productivity growth, as has been established by econometric studies. We want to have good training and schooling system, investment in human capital, occupational health care and stuff. All this is good for the individual, it is good for the economy. They were motivated by social democratic ideals, but they also boosted economic growth. And there is even a further feedback loop that is very important, because such policies that were geared to share the fruits of economic growth between everybody, and they were geared to mitigate the risks that are inherent in a market economy at the individual level, so that when you get sick or unemployed, you don't starve, you get something from society. These policies in turn made the political support for globalization and openness, economic openness. They sustain the political support for such policies. So we have not been protectionist in the Nordic countries. We have accepted technological change. We have never been Luddites or against free trade. You can compare that with, say, the populism of the latest decades in American politics, for example, where the social safety nets are quite shabby and poor, and that creates a fertile political platform for supporting ailing industries, or trying to by other means to give populistic gifts to large segments of voters, like the subprime loans perhaps were. That is something that has been emphasized by some quite orthodox economists lately. So neoclassical economists, that is sort of normal economists like myself, they like these policies. We like to think that the market economy can be efficient, but it does not take care of everything. There will not arise a market for social insurance. A child cannot buy an insurance against having having poor parents or being born in a poor neighborhood. Instead, we want to have public services that take care of education and healthcare. We want to have publicly funded social security. We want to have public investment in human capital. And furthermore, labor markets are not perfect. It's very useful also to use labor market institutions to sustain creative destruction. And this is precisely the Rehn-Meidner or the Nordic model of wage bargaining, where we try to see to it that wage increases are more or less uniform across all sectors of the economy. So for many economists, at least in Europe and even in the United States, a Nordic society is a kind of win-win proposition and a good society that a rational individual would choose if one had to choose before one knew which particular person one will become in society. This during that golden age of the build-up of the Nordic welfare state, there was also a kind of happy coincidence or happy some friendly attitude between social democracy and the current economic and social expertise. The Keynesian economics was of course a kind of very natural source of ideas for social democratic full employment policies, sociology and social studies as well, and that sustained an attitude of trying to introduce social innovations like comprehensive school systems or other new institutions. And in general, by and large, this social democratic project was hugely successful. The Nordic countries are among the wealthiest countries in the world, and at the same time they tend to be land on top in comparisons of life quality and equality. And it's also worth pointing out, as I do in the paper, that this did not necessitate any particular industrial configuration. I mean, all the Nordic countries have quite different industrial structures, although people in these countries tend to think that their well-being is based on specific things, like Danes on farming, or Finns on forest, and Sweden on these old top-tier industrial firms. But to an economist, this suggests that, in fact, this good solution of having both open markets and market-friendly policies with social security and publicly funded education, this is a good solution that works for whatever industrial policies and whatever resource endowments that the economy might have at its disposal. There are some comparisons in the paper. We look at long-term economic progress, in general long-term productivity growth, which is really the main driver of our material and even human well-being. In that respect, the Nordics have really fared very, very well. And then you might ask, well, why worry? What's the problem then if the Nordic solution and the social democratic solution is so good? Well, this is what this paper is really about, and most of these arguments are in section 5, the entitled "The Political Disconnect" in the paper. The main point of that section of the paper is that it is not enough for this model to be very much liked by economists. It also needs to continuously to build or to sustain a political support for the responsible economic and social policies that are needed to sustain it. And there is a kind of contradiction in as much as I can understand, so that the political ideals and aspirations that really created the energies of the labor movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the values that created the Nordic society, they are less well aligned with what good economic policy should look like now, at least from the point of view of a kind of mainstream economist like myself. And in my view, the main challenge of the Nordic model has not much to do with the external environment and globalization or technologies, as is often thought. In my view, the main threat to the sustainability of the Nordic welfare state model comes from the inside. It is really an issue of whether we will even in the future be able to sustain such responsible and stringent economic policies that will keep the Nordic welfare state viable and avoid excessive public debt. The main changes, the drivers of this change, have to do with the age structure, increased migration of people, and even factor mobility in general, namely the mobility of capital in the global economy. What do I mean by this? Well, many things have changed, and I will now sort of very fast browse myself through these aspects of this problem as I see it and as it is analyzed in that section of the paper. One very important and big change that also is touched upon in many other papers of this NordMod project, has to do with the age structure. When in the golden age of the 50s, 60s, 70s, when all these reforms were launched and welfare state institutions like daycare centers or public health or comprehensive primary schools were created, then the demographic phase was such that financing these reforms did not really seem very problematic, since the dependency ratio was quite advantageous, and there was a continuous flow of people from primary production and from the countryside to the modern economy. So new cohorts of taxpayers were larger than the previous ones, and future cohorts of taxpayers were larger than today's ones, so that it's creating these public services and public expenditures never seemed a real sort of problem. The budget constraint seemed kind of secondary, and the creation of the welfare state institutions seemed more or less a matter of political will. Well, there are some people here who are old enough, like myself, to remember the discussion of the 60s and 70s. And now, ex post, we know that this was also sustained by the advantageous demographics, and in that respect, now society has changed. The active cohorts are more or less stable. They don't grow. The dependency ratio changes to an unfavorable direction. The number of active people shrinks to the relative to the entire population. And this is very sort of trivial. It's trivial demographic mathematics, but it creates a problem for public finances. So it is much more difficult to finance reform, and for politicians and even social democratic politicians, it's more difficult and less responsible now to launch new reforms, since everything must be paid for by the same voters who vote for such reforms. Another aspect of this is that we now live in a completely globalized capital market. So it is not meaningful at the national level to discuss higher wages, in the sense that we extract out something from the capitalists, as we perhaps did in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Since if capital does not get the rate of return that it will get, so the profitability and the rate of return that it will get elsewhere in the global economy, it will simply leave. So you have to live with that restriction, but that is very hard for the labor movement and I think for the trade unions to internalize in their thinking, in their culture. Many trade union actives and many labor movement voters, I think, they still see the sort of this issue as a kind of competition of strength, where the labor movement uses its collective power resources to extract something from capitalists. But that is impossible as far as I see in this new environment. So in the golden age, as I suggested, there was labor supply was never an issue. There was an ongoing internal migration from the countryside and primary production to the modern economy. On the other hand, the capital market was national, and there was a regulation of international capital movements. Then investment was the scarce resource, whereas labor was not. And that created, in that golden age, there was room, and it was completely sort of intelligent and motivated to talk about state-driven investment programs. And this was perhaps most typical for countries like Finland and Norway that had a more sort of etatist and state-driven growth model, a kind of developmental state in this country in particular. But now again, in the present environment, with an aging population, labor has become the scarce resource. We have, at least in this country, we have shrinking cohorts of active people of working age. And even in a country like Sweden, employment growth does not completely, but does to a large extent depend on immigration of working age people. So our labor forces do not grow. Labor is the scarce resource. On the other hand, capital is not scarce. Capital is global. We will get investments. They might come from whichever country in the world, but we must see to it that they are profitable enough. We must accept the fact that the rate of return for productive investment is dictated by the global economy. We cannot affect the functional distribution of income. What else? Well, I suggested that in that older golden social democratic age, there was a kind of happy friendship or cooperation between the intellectual tools of economics and social democratic policies, in stabilization policy and full employment targets. Nowadays, macroeconomic policies is to a large extent bound by rules, fiscal rules and long-term surpluses and sustainability, monetary policies bound by inflation targets, and the policy agenda, for very natural reasons, in an era of a deteriorating dependency ratio, the policy agenda is dominated, at least as it is proposed by economists, it's dominated by labor supply and work incentive issues. And furthermore, the dominant theory of equilibrium unemployment that underlies monetary and fiscal policy, it squarely suggests that, in fact, by increasing aggregate demand, you cannot create full employment. You only can come down to the Nairu level, but if you want to cut that Nairu or the equilibrium rate of unemployment, then you have to introduce nasty supply-side reforms like cutting unemployment benefits or doing other things that unions and labor movements do not like. So there is a kind of inimical relationship nowadays between what economists in ministries of finance and universities think and what economists within the trade union movement and their affiliations think. So it's very different from the 50s, 60s and 70s. I also say something about the public sector unions in the paper. I suggest that a good government must also be able to stand up to unions and to public sector unions in particular if it wants to run responsible economic policies. Now, the environment has changed in many respects and in a way that makes it just more challenging and more unfavorable for social democracy and the labor movement. Of course, this does not by any means imply that similar problems would not affect other political parties. And it is not in general true that social democrats have run more irresponsible economic policies. We can, from the Nordic countries, find many from the last decades. We can find many instances of even non-socialist parties using sort of short-sighted, running short-sighted and populistic economic policies that are not good for the sustainability of the welfare state in the long run. But still, what I suggest in the paper is that this modern policy agenda and this economic political environment is simply possibly more unfavorable for social democrats than for other parties. And this has much to do with the fact that it is the agenda of labor supply that dominates now, and for good reason. It should dominate, since we have this problem of a stagnant labor force, but increasing demand for public resources and an increasing dependency ratio. So the labor supply agenda is a kind of logically correct response to the challenges we are facing. But it's a very difficult agenda for trade unions and labor party politicians. We must talk about incentives to work, the retirement age, the level of unemployment benefits. In all the Nordic countries from the 90s onwards, there has been a kind of activation turn in social policies where social and labor market policy has contained more elements of workfare and kind of exchange between social outlays and some kind of contributions by the unemployed. All this in order to encourage people to work. So the most extreme example that is, at least by many economists, is regarded as a quite successful one is the Danish flexicurity model. I mean, income support is good in Denmark, but the unemployed cannot be unemployed for very, very long, not at least if they if they want to keep their leisure. They are sort of harassed by the labor market policy authorities and encouraged and how would I say, cajoled to find work. Immigration is also a difficult issue, since at least on paper successful immigration would mitigate these structural problems of the public sector, since that would simply increase the pool of employed people as compared to the number of people who need public resources and do not work. But it is also a difficult issue for many unions and leftist politicians and workers who, I mean, we economists, we tend to think that the rate of unemployment in the long run is completely independent of the size of the labor force. So if the labor force grows, the rate of unemployment will not in the long run be affected. We will have the same unemployment rate even if we have more people in the labor market. But the workers who sort of live in the short run, they don't believe these economist sort of theoretical abstractions, and they meet the competition of the immigrant workers more immediately. They will be against such policies. And it is my sort of guess or hypothesis that it is these elements, increased immigration and even this activation turn in labor market and social policy, that has really frustrated many traditional voters of the social democratic parties and trade union activists and made them turn towards these right-wing nationalist and populist politicians. And social democracy seems torn between these sort of responsible sort of neoclassical economics policies that are advocated by economists in the ministries of finance or people like myself, and then by the needs of competing of the votes of these discouraged workers. We see that very clearly we see it in Finnish social democracy now. There is a contest for the party leadership where you can see some of these aspects. We see it very clearly in France, where François Hollande was elected on a kind of leftist platform, but he must now turn to a very market-friendly Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, who is more like of the economist camp, and he says he wants to reconcile the left with the idea of the market economy. So that makes social democracy weaker. As a kind of declaration of my own intent, you should really squarely place me in the sort of market economy camp. I think that in the long run, it's best to try to combine the market economy and social democratic ideals, and we cannot really avoid this labor supply activation, immigration policy agenda. It is politically difficult, but as far as I can understand as an economist, it is the correct response to the challenges we are facing now. But of course, it must be coupled with these good traditional elements of Nordic social democracy, education, training, policies. We want to have high employment. That sort of is something that demands both political action, but it's also something that demands something from the individual. Social democracy should not shy away from tough supply-side reforms. At the same time, we must preserve these strong investments in human capital and individuals. If social democracy starts to pander to nationalists or state-owned manufacturing, I think it will be a dead end. So this is more or less the central content of the paper. And perhaps let me conclude by just emphasizing that these challenges and difficulties are common for all the political parties in the Nordic countries. And in my view, it is also, we should appreciate the fact that the mainstream right-wing or center parties, they are quite social democratic nowadays, in the sense that they don't want to challenge the very idea of these social democratic institutions. But in the long run, are they resistant towards disintegrating processes that lead to more privatizations and erosion of the welfare state? Which parties and which coalitions will run economic policies that are responsible enough to preserve the social democratic welfare state institutions without an exploding public debt? That's the real issue. Thank you.